All right, good afternoon, everyone. After a very interesting People Gap session, it is now my pleasure to introduce the speaker of our last GapSummit session of the day, the regulatory gap session. And the session is chaired by Ms. Marianne Kruger. She is founder and managing director of IMI Consulting, and with over 30 years of industry experience, she's working in strategic development and advice, as well as consultancy in biotech, funding, medtech, as well as diagnostics. It is my pleasure to introduce her, and please join me in welcoming the session of the chair of the session.
It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And we've been given a very difficult task. For 1 hour, we have to dig into regulatory, IP, and tell you what's happening in there, and then to try and see if, in fact, the regulatory scenario is really adapting to be ready for the stars of tomorrow. And that's not going to be easy. We have today an interesting panel, and one of the things, however, that is missing in our panel, before I tell you how wonderful they are, what is missing in our panel is a country regulatory expert, because the countries also have regulatory offices, officials, and their own guidelines. So I would like to tell you that we have today an IP expert who flew in from the United States for you. We have an industry, or I would say an agency expert, an enterprise agency expert. We have an EMEA expert, and we have certainly the fourth largest, big pharma, the fourth largest company representative. I will introduce them each separately later. They will present, and then we will ask you for questions. I'd like to introduce Oblon-Spivak. Oblon-Spivak brings or has obtained U.S. utility patents more than any other law firm in the world for 24 consecutive years. In addition, they have clients that go back as long as 40 years, which I would say there are very few firms in the world that can brag that. And thirdly, just last year, they issued 6,252 patents on behalf of their clients. This represents an increase of 7% for them. Most importantly, they seem to be leading all other firms in terms of the number of such proceedings being handled. And we're talking here about post-grant practice group. It's leading in this type of proceeding. So who do we have here today? We have Dr. Kristen Grüneberg. She's in the United States, in Alexandria, Virginia, but she's a German. And Kristen, like yourself, started her career in science. She is a former senior research scientist and chemist. Kristen is especially experienced in representing European and Japanese chemical, biotechnical, and pharmaceutical companies. So I can go on, but Kristen, I turn it to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful conference. I just want to give you a little bit of an impression of what is happening in the IP world, and make you also aware. I know many of you are scientists, aspiring scientists, PhD students, master degree students. And I hear some of you are very interested in starting your own companies. So the most important thing that you need to know, apart from the technology that you are all developing, is, well, what value can I actually add by filing a patent application? And how important is it really not just to publish and go to conferences and present the results of your research and exchange with researchers, but how important is it really to file a patent application. So I want to raise your awareness to the topic and give you a little bit of an impression of what is going on in Europe. Now, I'm of course a US attorney, so, but I will present quite a few charts on Europe. Now, in summary, what I'm talking about is, oh, something messed up here. Really, medical technologies are leading the world in patent application in Europe, are leading the patent applications in Europe, and are number 4 in terms of international applications, while biotech and pharma applications have really declined in 2013 compared to the previous year. There is a large, yeah, I don't know what happened to the slide. There's really a large effort to harmonize the IP laws between different regions of the world. And right now, what we're seeing is that there's a slow harmonization between the IP laws of the United States, Europe, but also other WIPO countries. Now, really the emphasis is on slow because there's still quite a few problems. And there are a number of groups that focus on the harmonization. Now, there are 4 main topics that are really in focus right now. One is the so-called grace period. Europe doesn't have it. There is no grace period. Once you have published, you can no longer get a patent. But, for example, the United States has now what is called a personal grace period. So you can publish your own research, and for a year it won't bar you to still obtain a patent. So how do you harmonize that between different countries? It's a serious issue. The 18-month publication period. Why is that a problem? So you file your first application in Europe, let's say, and a year later you come to the US, and within 18 months of your European filing date, your application is published in the US, and there will be a long time between the publication date and the date the patent is actually granted. So what's going to happen? Your competitors are going to monitor your published application. They're going to see what claims you have, you're going to see what you're disclosing, and it will be quite some time for them to give them an opportunity to design around your technology. Another issue is the treatment of what is called conflicting applications. In other words, what happens if you have published a published application that is filed earlier than a conflicting application of a competitor. Prior user rights is a very interesting problem that is in focus in terms of harmonization. Different countries treat it differently. What is prior user rights? Very simple. You have a process that you're practicing as a trade secret. It's not known to anyone. And all of a sudden, a competitor comes and patents exactly the process that you have been practicing even before the filing date of your competitor's application. So now what do? Different countries treat it differently. In some countries, this is a defense against infringement. In others, it is perhaps not. Now, there are some interesting issues in terms of the BRICS countries. I understand there is sort of interest in what's happening in the BRICS countries. As you know, the United States is very self-centered, so we usually don't care too much about it. But I still talk about it a little bit. So in the BRICS countries, we have seen an increase in patent applications. But at the same time, we have noticed, well, some countries, for example, India, say, well, that's great, but we're just going to give you compulsory licenses for certain medications because we want them to be available for all poor people or people of lower income. So that's an issue here. I'm going to touch a little bit, if there's time, on utility model zones and how they can be used in parallel with the traditional patent system. And another interesting issue is while the developed world has a very well-developed patent system and is using it quite extensively, as I said, US, Europe, Japan, Korea, China now. There are certainly countries where multinational companies do not file patents. Apple is probably not going to file patents in all African or South American nations. And oftentimes the issue is, well, yes, we could file a patent there. There is a patent office, but there's no market there. So why would we do it? So then the question arises, well, why don't I go with my company and produce products there? And here you have to be careful because the developed world has regulations that say, you can't just go in terms, for example, of the United States. You can't just go into another country where there's no patent protection for a certain process that is patented in the US. And then import the product to the US. You can't do that. That's a big problem. So these are some of the issues I'm quickly going to touch on. Just talking about the filing numbers in Europe, as you can see, you have pharmaceuticals are down, biotech is down. That's obviously not a good thing. Another interesting statistics is sort of the innovation density. Countries that have sort of a fairly small population still have a comparatively high percentage of patent applications. So with Switzerland leading, I don't know if my pointer points that high, but US and UK, at least in terms of this particular list, being at the bottom. Now make no mistake, in the US, there are about 580,000 patent applications filed, half of which originate in the US. So in terms of total numbers, this is maybe a little misleading. Just some of the harmonization efforts. There are different committees that talk about harmonization. The Asia-Pacific Patent Cooperation Treaty is one thing. The Tegernsee Group consists of various countries, including Denmark, France, Germany, Japan, UK, US, and the European Patent Office also is involved in that. You have trilateral and the IP5 talks. One interesting thing is the so-called global patent prosecution highway. This is actually a great thing that's coming our way. We don't have it yet fully. We have some patent prosecution highway between some countries. What does it mean? You file a patent application in Japan, for example, you get claims allowed. Now you take those claims and you show them to the US patent examiner, and you will obtain a patent much faster. So these are some of the things that are meant to harmonize and simplify the process of obtaining patents worldwide. Okay. A little bit about PCT. So PCT filings have increased tremendously with US, Japan, and China leading, and really the big increase coming from the United States and China. I think I'm out of time, so I'm just, I mentioned already in the beginning some of the patent-free zone situation. In terms of utility model applications, those are sometimes less, or not sometimes, they're often less expensive than utility models are less expensive than utility patent applications. And you can get them very quickly in some of these countries. But you have to be careful, you can't use both together. In Brazil, obtaining a patent takes a long time. So if your product cycle is less than 8 years, you may want to consider if it actually is meaningful for you to apply for a patent, because the patent won't issue in time. I'm not talking so much about that. I'm just going to skip that. And yeah, TRIPS, here is sort of the interesting case of the Gleiweg cancer drug from Novartis that was introduced in India. They tried to get patent protection. India denied it. And that's, of course, a big loss for Novartis. And really, the idea here was something that the BRICS countries and other countries don't really like, is the so-called evergreening of technologies, where you get a patent in one country, it runs out, and now you go to a different country and file for the same technology with some slight modification. So they prevented that in India, and really Brazil and China and South Africa are following suit in raising the bar of what is patentable and trying to give probably more compulsory licenses. So I'm going to leave it at that as a discussion starter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to the questions of the panelists later on. I would like to introduce Titta Rosvall-Puplett. And I've asked her to introduce the European Biopharmaceutical Enterprises organization. And I think she has a special way of doing that.
Special way, Mr. Son. Don't worry, I'm not going to dance salsa here, but almost tempted. Just quickly, before I start, I have a little video. I got 1 extra minute from our moderator. Thank you very much. EBE is European Biopharmaceutical Enterprises, and we are a non-profit trade association. And 50 members that today support EBE's activities. Our audience is European village. We call the Brussels village in Europe, the Parliament, the Council, the European Commission, but also national government stakeholders. We try to be the voice of biopharmaceutical enterprises in Europe, and I'll have here a quick, hopefully the video works. Quick video that we have recently launched to explain who we are. Voila.
Could you give them a discount right away if they signed up?
Everything is negotiable in the world, and nothing is impossible. No, thank you very much for your attention indeed. And as I wasn't really planning to talk about EBE, I think I've done it. In any case, I am here still to the later today as well as tomorrow, so happy to catch up. Many of our members are SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. And it's very important that as organisation as EBE, we're not only the voice of those issues and challenges that the companies face, but we also offer you hands-on services when it comes to those how to and where can I and all these kinds of things. I can make a quick example. We had last week a very successful, a beautiful workshop organised together with European Biotechnology Network. By the way, if you don't know, notice, Biotechnology Network, EBN, a body that really gives you hands-on support on how to find public funding. And I wasn't here this morning, but I know you had a session on funding. I'm sorry I missed it, but I'm sure you went through some of those elements, how to tack private equity funding or the venture capitalists, or at the same time, everything from the Horizon 2020 that's currently on in Europe. So I'm happy to also answer some of those things if you have any. But without that note, I move forwards to really what we talk about here today, and it's really the need to adapt regulatory pathways. I also know earlier on you spoke a little bit about personalised medicines and the needs to move towards that direction. We know science is evolving in a great deal. We need to make sure that we work towards that space, all of us together. There is 2 numbers only I want to point out from that slide, is the fact that really biotech matters. 50% of the medicines in pharmaceutical pipeline comes from biotech, meaning small and medium-sized companies. And 20% of the products in the whole market originate from biologics. And it's very important to also know that we've done some surveys that in Europe, 70% of SMEs have less than 50 employees. But this is where the most jobs are. This is where the innovation happens. So to any of those people who are thinking of starting up or spinning out or other way around, This is the key. That's where innovation happens, and we all need to work together to help Europe in that mission. From science perspective, we know that, and I am not a scientist by background, but many of my colleagues are, and I'm very happy to learn from them, of course, that even breast cancer today is actually 10 different diseases. This is why, because we understand that the molecular knowledge we have and the massive amount of data can be translated into real therapies. And we are in a mission today to try to find answers to why some medicines work and why they don't. Personalized medicines really is something where we think with that data we have, we can really create something that most of the medicines should be working and creating less side effects. The molecular diagnostics that we create nowadays do support the pharmaceutical development at the same time. We should aim to treat a population where everybody responds to, and that's the bottom line and all of our aims. So science is really leading the revolution in targeted and more personalized therapies. This is allowed by the more precise diagnostics, but it also requires smaller and much, much faster clinical trials. And that's why we're talking here today about the need to adapt regulatory pathways as well. And as we know, the science has evolved to such extent that already there is a lot of discussion, and EMA has recently launched their pilot plans toward adaptive licensing. And this is something I know that our member companies strongly support. We need to make sure that we can utilize this new science. But it's not only the regulatory people and the bodies in all the various different countries that we have to work together with. We need to make sure that the medicines actually get to the market. We need to be sure that health technology assessments are working hand in hand, that when we're starting to design clinical trials, that health technology assessments are already part of this whole design, and so on and so forth. We also have to make sure somewhere down the line that the authorities deciding on pricing and reimbursement are part of the game. Today we don't know how that all will look like, but it's very important that we're already engaging in the dialogue and we try to make a step change to make all this happen. I'm not going to explain this slide further, but really the question here today, and I hope for the panel and all of us to try to figure out is Europe ready? We know that 50% of global biologics originate from Europe, and they've been transferred to US to be able to further develop and take a market access role there and allow to those SMEs to grow. So the question is Europe really becoming a bio-incubator for US? If that's the case, we should do something. Venture capital funding is moving more and more to late-stage development. But Europe is doing something that we know, where public funding is trying to increase the early-stage financing. And Horizon 2020 from the European Commission is something that I think can be a huge power to make this change. But it's up to us to figure out how to tap into that massive resource and be active about it. We also need to consider that evidence and data is the new currency, not the euros or the yens or the others. It's evidence and data and being clever about it. So really, that's my last, is really adaptive pathways are key for everyone. And I'm really looking forward to a dialogue with all of you because you know much more than I do and I want to also learn from you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Melanie Carr, and she's currently head of small-medium enterprises at the European Medicines Agency. Melanie is a pharmacist and has been working at the agency for over 18 years. She joined the pharmacovigilance department of the EMEA in '96 and transferred to the new chemical substance sector in '98. In '99, she became a member of the EMEA task force responsible for implementing the EU legislation on orphan medicinal products and setting up the committee accordingly. By the way, for all of us who have been in pharmaceuticals for many years, that made pharmaceutical history. And since 2005, she has been responsible for implementing the agency's SME initiative. And I hope you have good surprises for us and a big budget.
Thank you, Mariana, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today to meet the SMEs of tomorrow. I'm here, I'm replacing the Executive Director of the EMA, Guido Razzi. He sends his apologies. Back in Canary Wharf, where the EMA is based, we have a big bilateral going on with our US counterparts today, so he has had to stay to meet with the FDA. But I am, as Mariana said, I'm one of the dinosaurs of the agency, so hopefully I can explain to you how we can support innovation in my 5 minutes run through. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the EMA, it's essentially a network. It's coordinating those resources at member state level to evaluate and supervise new medicines. And primarily we're working through a centralized marketing authorization procedure, which results in one authorization valid in the 28 member states of the European Union. But we're also focusing very early on giving advice to companies early in development as they design studies to generate data to support marketing authorizations. And there's just a list of some of the things that we do. The slides have gone a little bit funny, but hopefully you'll see them in the printouts. Okay, now I thought I'd start by talking about where does innovation stem from in Europe. And we had a trainee in the SME office last year who had a look at the last 3 years of centralized marketing authorizations for new active substances. And of the 94 molecules, what we found was on the red bars is that around 90% of those products are commercialized in Europe by very large or intermediate-sized pharma companies. And only 13% come from SMEs at the commercialization stage. But when we track back and look at the origin of the molecules, what we find is that less than 50% originate from big pharma, and some 27% from SMEs, but also academia, public-private partnerships, and private-private partnerships are very active in that originating phase. And of those 94 products, some 58% have been transferred to some extent during the product life cycle. And on the right-hand side of the slide, it shows the various directions of transfer. And the largest direction was from SMEs to large and medium-sized enterprises, some 33%. So of those 13% of SMEs that bring the products to marketing authorization, how do they fare through the regulatory approval process? Well, on the next slide, this just shows you from 2006, when the SME office was set up at the agency, how companies have fared, SME companies filing marketing application requests have fared through the centralized approval process. And the blue is a negative outcome, and the green is a positive outcome. And what we can say is that SMEs filing marketing applications in Europe overall have a lower chance of success than all companies. It's some 53% for those 8 years versus a 78% success rate for all companies. But what is encouraging to see is that we're getting more companies through the scientific advice process, that in the last 5 years, the positives exceeded the negatives, and it's running at some 65% of success. This slide just summarizes the regulatory framework and what we're intending to do to enable companies to bring products to market. And on the left-hand side, you have the problem statement. So you have the changing landscape of R&D with complex clinical trials, very costly developments, high attrition rates. And in the middle part, in the green, is how regulators not only are acting as gatekeepers, but enablers. So by promoting dialogue, we have an innovation task force, we provide scientific advice, and also we support orphan medicines and SME companies. And also we're interacting, because development today is global, so we're interacting with our colleagues in Asia and in the US and around the world through the ICH process. But also we're concentrating on enabling companies to bring those products to the market. So we're also having dialogue with health technology assessment bodies such as NICE in the UK. And on the right-hand side in the blue box, just some of the areas where we're looking at adapting the regulatory process to promote innovation. So one thing that's key to any young entrepreneur to understand is that scientific advice from regulators throughout the development process is really key. So when you're designing your studies to determine the quality of the pharmaceutical form, when you're designing your non-clinical studies to support your first in man, when you're designing your confirmatory clinical studies, it's very important to discuss with the regulator to make sure that those studies are robust enough to support a marketing authorization. And again, I've just provided a copy of a publication which was published by some of our colleagues in scientific advice, which really shows that if you come for scientific advice from the agency and follow that advice, then there's an increased success factor when you come to file the marketing authorization. And my last slide is really talking about the future. So we're looking at ways to lower the regulatory hurdles in Europe to promote innovation. And one thing that we have done is launched an adaptive licensing pilot last week. So on the top slide, you'll see the traditional approach to licensing medicines, which is, companies generate a lot of data in the pre-authorization phase. They submit it, it's granted a marketing authorization, and then it's rolled out into the larger patient population in the post-authorization phase. And the idea of adaptive licensing is moving towards more iterative submission of data to enable earlier access to the market and continual evaluation of regulatory data and adaptive licensing. And that's currently open for pilots, so I'd say watch this space. And on that point, I think my 5 minutes are up, so I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
It makes me feel like a drill sergeant with their 5 minutes, doesn't it? I'd like to introduce Boris Azais. And Boris is Director of Public Policy, Europe and Canada for MSD, Merck. And I'd like for those of you that may not know the difference between Merck, the American Merck, and Merck Serono that you saw, they are two separate companies. So the Merck, the American Merck, which is represented in Europe under the name MSD, is a separate company from the Merck Serono of this morning or this afternoon. Yes, Boris?
Thank you. Well, I'll stay here since I don't have any slides. And the big difference is that Merck Serono, the German company, is a sponsor, and I'm just a speaker. So that's the difference. So MSD, an American company. And over dinner, I can tell you the whole story because it goes back to the involvement of the US government in the First World War. So, since there was already a lot of content covered here, I decided that I would share with you the policy perspective, basically. What does all this mean, and why, are we talking about the regulatory gap? And I want to encapsulate it with two main concepts, signaling and convergence. And those two things, signaling and convergence, are basically the key enablers of pharmaceutical innovation. Signaling is basically the government sending out a strong message to innovators that it wants a certain result. We want innovative medicines, or we are launching the war against cancer. That's very strong political commitment, but obviously this signaling is also taking place through a complex framework of incentives, such as IP rights, and also investment in science and investment in healthcare. So when you think about why we have pharmaceutical innovation, why we have products today that can treat patients, it's because basically during the 20th century, a number of government policies have been put in place. First, governments have invested in science, basic science and higher education, like here, and that enables innovators to identify targets and go after therapeutic targets. They've invested also in healthcare. All our healthcare systems have been built during the 20th century, and that has enabled a market basically a market that made it possible for people to have access to innovative therapies that were in any case very expensive on any given level. And thirdly, they've developed something that you can call industrial policy, which is a mix of incentives such as intellectual property rights, but market access to financing and so forth. So this all together is producing pharmaceutical innovation. And when you're discussing pharmaceutical policy, what it takes for governments to trigger innovation in pharmaceuticals, and I mean, biologics and all the whole medicines, it's always taking a shade of those policies. And what's very fascinating about any debate about pharmaceuticals is that you can take this argument from an industrial standpoint and say we need jobs and growth, but you can also take it from a scientific standpoint and say, is that truly innovative? Or a healthcare standpoint. For example, quality of life measurements might, make a big difference for patients versus something that would be looked at as amazingly innovative. And so basically that's the signaling. And convergence is really something that is happening very recently, and some of which has been already mentioned today, which is the idea that because of the complexity of the whole healthcare R&D enterprise, with all its life cycle going over 20, 30 years for any given product, it means that stakeholders have to come together, discuss and dialogue on, and share their values, share their goals, and share their solutions. And what you're seeing today, and for at least since the last decade, is an enmeshing of those research agendas, healthcare agenda, and what are the tools, what are the type of signaling and incentives that can make it happen. So this is, pretty abstract, but very concretely, when you're thinking about setting the research and development agenda, apart from those historical moments when, the U.S. government needed penicillin for its soldiers, or when, Richard Nixon launched this so-called war against cancer, you have increasingly a discussion that started in the mid-2000, 2004, 2005, and that was triggered by what we used to call the innovation drought, the fact that it became very difficult, or the companies, the pharmaceutical industry was developing or bringing to product bringing to the market less products than before. And so that triggered a lot of concern and discussion. And it started with the WHO report on priority medicines for the world and Europe, which was published in 2004, 2005. And basically it's an attempt by a health authority to set what could be a research and development agenda. What are the unmet medical needs? We need, what do governments can tell their research facility what they need? Similarly, because there was this concern about the decreased efficiency of the R&D efforts, the fact that it took increasing amount of money to bring a single product to the market, the FDA launched something called the critical path in 2007. There's really a very good seminal report from the FDA looking at the challenges that regulatory was putting on the innovation because of the high cost of failures at a late stage. So how can we signal to the innovators that certain things will not make it? And so since the higher cost of clinical development are at the latest phases, then if you equip innovators with strong signals through dialogue and sharing, methods and solutions, then eventually you're going to cut down on the price of research and enable more efficient R&D investments. And similarly, something that is happening since mostly the crisis, because the austerity measures that were triggered by the financial crisis triggered also a huge sort of wave of price cuts and really pushing back from payers in Europe on their pharmaceutical expenditures. So you have to remember that pharmaceutical expenditures represent about 15–16% of the health budget, but still, since it's a high item, easily identified, they're putting pressure on that. But since then, because there's also this, also an industrial policy component to what governments have in mind, they're coming back, and there are increasingly a number of what we call framework agreements between industry associations mainly, and governments, and we have examples in a number of countries in Europe, where they're trying to basically set the agenda of what could be a sustainable pricing and reimbursement model for their country. And they do that in partnership. And you have also examples here in the UK between the UK industry, ABPI, and NICE, which is the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, which is in charge of running cost-effectiveness studies or health technology assessments. And there's a partnership that was announced last month between the industry and NICE exactly on that. How can we set the agenda on what would be required to bring cost-effectiveness studies, sharing, again, values, goals, and solutions. So I think on the most active part of this debate, as you could see, is really the regulatory framework with what Melanie presented on the adaptive approval. You have to basically understand that regulatory approval, allowing a drug to come to the market, is based on a sort of big bang decision. So we accumulate data in very constrained, scientifically conducted randomized clinical trial, and we accumulate this data, and bam, we're going to get a market approval that will launch, enable the launch of the product and reach patients all over the market. What we're moving towards is something much more staggered, much more adapted to the information that we really have from what is working for the patients. And the idea is actually to accelerate this approval earlier than like a big bang approach, but also to measure what is really going on in the patient population that is broadening little by little. It's a very challenging model because it requires actually a lot of data and validated data to be at hand, something that healthcare systems are not yet able to produce, but as they are increasingly so moving towards to patient registries and IT-enabled electronic records and so forth, then eventually we're going to be able to harness all this real-world data and turn this into clinical evidence. So the reason I wanted to bring these two concepts, signaling and convergence, is because in your career, whatever you choose, you're going to have to think about what are the government policies that enable what you're trying to achieve. And they will play a role. And in the pharmaceutical research area, they are quite complex and numerous. It's not just how much money is invested in science. It's also how much money a government is ready to pay for the final product that will make it to the market. And that information, that signal, is basically moving back into towards the pipeline, and it does inform some of the investment decisions made in R&D. And so eventually, everybody around the table, including foundations, patient groups, civil society, are now increasingly involved in setting the agenda, and that's an opportunity, but also very challenging for the people who are already in place, including regulators and industry. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. Yes, please, right here in front. Yes, I think it's on its way.
First, thank you very much for the very insightful presentations. I would like to touch upon a topic that has been mentioned frequently today, which is personalized medicine. Apparently, I have a feeling that personalized medicine changes the regulatory landscape dramatically because it's the diagnostic approvals and the drug approvals or medicines approvals, they were separate from each other. And I think even they operate under different regulations, and the personalized medicine would require a different set of guidelines and regulations as well. So how do you see that? Well, I think it's not a challenge of tomorrow, as we are the leaders of tomorrow, but I think it's a challenge of today. Yeah. And I would like to know your opinions on how it might evolve.
Should we start, Melanie? Yeah.
No, just to clarify, indeed, personalised medicine is quite an exciting area moving forward and looking at the innovative products that are coming through the pipeline. But in terms of the regulatory framework, it's the same. So there may be some personalised medicines that could target a specific mutation, for example, in cancer, and they could, as such, perhaps become orphan, or it could be classed as a rare disease, and then they would fall into the same regulatory framework as any orphan product.
But does it apply to the companion diagnostic as well? Because you need another approval for the diagnostic.
Yes, the diagnostic would be approved in parallel. In fact, we've had one recently this month from an SME based in the US called Endocyte, who developed a product for ovarian cancer, where they out-licensed to Big Pharma. No.
They do the imaging, and we do the product.
Yes. But they did start out with both. This is about the product transfers. So, indeed, I mean, the diagnostic will be licensed at the same time because it enables you to select the patient population that you're going to treat. So you see more companion diagnostics. But indeed, they would go through the same regulatory approval process. It would just be, that the regulators would tailor the advice to ensure that the development supports the specific subset that the medicine's targeting.
Yes, please, here in front.
Thanks. Earlier in the day, we talked about how more and more biotherapeutics are dominating the pharma picture. So I had a question about access. Moving from generic drugs to biosimilars as this trend, how do you think that's going to affect the overall access globally in different countries?
Would like to answer? Would you like to try that? Yes.
Yeah. In terms of generics and biosimilars, I mean, you tend to see peaks depending on when the data exclusivity expires. So for biosimilars, when the patent rights and the data exclusivity expires, you tend to see a wave of biosimilars coming through, and we've had the monoclonals authorized recently in Europe. But that will tend to be driven by the innovative products and what's coming off exclusivity. So it's still, very innovative what comes through the EMA, and the generic products tend to be handled more at national level, if you like.
Yeah, maybe I can, provide an attempt to respond, because it's a very broad question, and obviously you're going to have different approaches, be it in Brazil or India or South Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa and so forth. I think it's still very much unknown territory. Probably then, as Kristen mentioned, you need to also look at the patent portfolio. A lot of products were not deemed worth patenting in the vast majority of the developing world because of the linkage with the healthcare system. You see, the question that the patent lawyer is going to ask him or herself is, well, yes, maybe we can get a patent, but then is it enforceable? Is the judicial system up to scratch? And then is there a market? So that's why during the 2000s, for all sorts of reasons I won't go into, but IP became a hard political issue, but it sort of hid the fact that you could still not have access to any free drug without a healthcare system in place. So we've seen cases, of even product donations that would not even reach the patients. So there's this complication of the link between what is available in theory and what is actually accessible to the patients through medical doctor and all that.
And I
Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah.
Yes.
No, but there is,
Yes.
well, yes and yes and no. I mean, there is a developed country model where access, is dealt with public financing. So, outside, the US or Chile, if you look at the OECD countries, 80% of healthcare is financed by the public. So that means through taxes, social contributions, and so forth. And so the way it's managed is not through IP, it's through maybe price controls or different procurement schemes. That is missing in most of the developing countries. And so there is an attempt to also say, well, let's deal with it through the IP system. That will enable access, but it doesn't really help the patients in the sense that you still don't have health care. You see, so it's a phase of development at best, but also there are other industrial policy components,
Boris,
such
I
as
think that,
generic companies and so forth.
Titta would like to add something.
Sorry, just go on. I could just come to that. No, I just wanted to add as well that in Europe we have been very successful on bringing biosimilars to the market. We know that over the decade, 10 biosimilars have been marketed under 18 different brand names. Now, the issue is like you say, is the healthcare system. How is the uptake? Is the understanding there? Recent study of the Alliance of Safe Biologic Medicine show that the physicians, the clinicians don't understand the difference between biosimilars and the possibilities that they could bring. So there's really a lot of work to be done in educating and raising awareness around these special drugs, to really allow then the market access at the same time to happen and reach the patient in a way. So
we have time for one more question. In the back, please. Yes.
Good afternoon, thank you. Andrew Herr from the US. Some of the most interesting developments in science are coming in synthetic biology and living organisms that can both sense and act. However, to bring a living organism into the clinic would require not only that it was safe as a drug, but that then it would be released into the environment. Do you see any regulatory pathways for approval of living organisms for drugs deployed into patients? Thank you.
Thank you.
You mean kids?
I think, Melanie, I think you're on. Yes.
No, indeed. I mean, there is a possibility. I mean, we have experience, I think, with larvae in wound healing, which is classed as a medicinal product in Europe. It would be an area where we would recommend that you come for an early dialogue, and we would also be looking at things, but as for any medicine, the environmental risk assessment, but certainly there is a possibility to bring living organisms through the approval process. But there might be some discussion around whether it's classified as a medicinal product or not, but that's a different issue which would be handled quite separately and quite early on.
Thank you very much. Before I close the session, I'd like to ask Kristen. Kristen, you have a wonderful audience with ideas. They're scientists. They're the future scientists of tomorrow. What last message would you like to leave them with?
Patent early and patent often.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank my wonderful panelists. And I want to thank you for the questions. I'm sorry there wasn't as much time as we would have wanted. And as I said, you missed the real interesting part, which is the national healthcare organizations and what they're doing to pricing. But that's for another time. So no more said. I thank you all very much. Thank you very much for your contribution.